Hello kindred longevity lifestyle designers, this is Gavin here, secretsoflongevity.com. This is the second video in a 5-part series on how to improve or increase IQ through lifestyle means. It's part of an ongoing series on IQ I've been doing, but the how to improve IQ section was just so big that I decided to break it up into 5 sections, and I'm very much glad for that, as each section seems to be at least a half hour long. And we've got a great video on nutrition and specifically diet and how that affects IQ. We're going to be doing some other ones on supplements and specific nutrients, or rather herbs and specific nutrients that affect IQ. Those are 2 separate videos, and then also another one on things to avoid. And then the one I've already done is lifestyle habits. So how does exercise, how does the way you learn, the things you read, how do all these things affect IQ? And you can find all 5 videos below. Obviously, since it's the second one, the other 3 aren't up, but you can find the one down there. And as time goes on and I make the other ones, and you're watching this down the road, you can also go down there to find the other 4 videos once they're all up. So this is a really heavily cited video. I've got about 21 references I'll be making, which you can always go into the drop-down menu below. Below those 5 videos, you can see a numbered list of links to journal articles, but also a couple other videos I've done that I'm going to be talking about, which you should check out, pause the video, and look at them if you want to see exactly the study I'm talking about and the details surrounding it. And the underlying premise of this video and some of the ideas behind what it is I'm talking about is that diet can be seen kind of like exercise, in that when we put our body through stress, whether it's lifting a weight to the point where our muscle breaks down a little bit and then it repairs and gets bigger and stronger, or if it's the same thing but on our cardiovascular system, there's that stress we put on our body, and this is a good kind of stress which then our body recovers from and reacts to that incoming force on the micro level all throughout our body. So diet does a similar thing, or at least we can make and create a diet that does a similar thing. There are some schools of thought out there that want to view everything stressful on the body as negative. We want to appease every aspect of our endocrinology so that we have the most minimal amount of stress hormones in our body at any one time. However, there's a lot of different processes in the body, a lot to do with the brain, that actually benefit from a little bit of stress, not all the time and not too much, but a controlled amount of stress which has the same kind of impact that exercise might have on us, which allows for these survival type mechanisms to turn on, and we get beneficial things that happen from it. It doesn't mean that everything I'm going to talk about in this video should be applied or that works for everyone. So one of my ongoing things about diet you probably have been aware of is that I don't have a one-size-fits-all diet plan that I recommend for everyone. I say there's some broad things that we need to keep in mind and that we need to do, like eat organic, eat whole foods, minimize junk foods, stay away from GMOs, etc. But there's a wide range of different things, whether it's higher animal foods or lower animal foods and higher plant foods is one example of a scale of extremes, and also the center, and people fall somewhere along that, and so you have to figure this out for yourself. And same goes for these other things I'll be talking about. So to start off, we're going to look at ketosis, and that's obviously a very high animal foods type diet, and the benefits it can actually confer to those who happen to work on a low carb diet or low carb plan. There's a substantial amount of research that's been done both on rats and some on humans that shows definite improvements in cognition. So this first article, link number 1, is just an explanation, kind of a primer of how ketosis works, what it does, and what the ketones do in the brain and how they can improve brain function. So I'm just putting that as the first article for anyone that's unfamiliar with ketosis or a high-fat, low-carb diet and how it works exactly. That's just a good explanation for it. Link number 2 is a study that shows that ketones are neuroprotective. There's 2 in particular that were looked at, and it describes how they prevent the degradation of neurons in the brain. Link number 3 is actually going to be an example of bad science. So this, upon just a quick glance, might show, oh, ketogenic diets are bad for brain function because they make you tired and sluggish. Well, if you look at the amount of time that people were given in this particular study to adapt to the ketogenic diet, it's within a 1 to 2 week period. So it's quite common knowledge once you start reading about how to get into ketosis if you're on a conventional diet, that people take up to 2 weeks to fully adapt and actually start to get their energy levels back. So if you're on a moderate carb or even a higher carb diet, you're going to take about 2 weeks with lower energy and kind of a foggy brained thing going on where you are very tempted to go back to carbs. You probably have some sugar cravings. You really have to get your body used to being able to produce the ketones and using the fatty acids as fuel for your muscles as well and your whole body. So it's really not something that can be done and tested in such a short period of time. You need to allow for some adaptation. You really want to give it, I'd say, a month or longer before you start testing people to see what their experiences are on the diet. Link number 4 below is actually a study on humans just showing that the elderly had improvements in memory, verbal memory specifically, after 6 weeks on a ketogenic plan. So there are some theories around ketogenic diets that they're most optimal later in life, and there's a lot of benefits one gets, such as the lowered blood sugar, the less stress on the body when it comes to a lessening of metabolic stress that would come from carbohydrates that tends to be a problem as people get older. You have your diabetes, your cardiovascular disease, your Alzheimer's. All these things have components related to excess blood sugar. So when you get on a high-fat diet and blood sugar stabilizes, you have a lot of benefits, but really we can get these things earlier in life, especially in modern times when people have a tendency to develop these things. But it shows quite clearly that these elderly people got quite a lot of benefit from it. So link number 5 below is the video I made just before this one, but of course if you're watching this down the road, you may not have seen that, and it is just me describing and showing how there's a likelihood that if you have a specific type of ancestry and blood type and these other factors, including Neanderthal genes perhaps in your genetic history, that you might have a higher preponderance for functioning better on a higher fat diet. So I'm throwing this in here just as a demonstration of the type of person and the type of background you might have that would make you eligible for functioning well on a lower carb, high fat, medium protein type diet. So a lot of people, I just want to also say this, is that when they hear low carb they think high protein, and it does not have to be that way. In fact, that is how a lot of people run into problems, is they go too high protein, medium to lower fat even, and that just runs into problems. Because when you're doing low carbs and medium to low fat, all that protein you're consuming is both very damaging to the body in such quantities, but also it gets converted to carbohydrates. So it's kind of pointless at that point because you're just stressing your body way more than it needs to be, and not in any good way. And so yeah, I really don't recommend a low carb diet for most people. It's a very specific type of people with your background and what you function well on, and perhaps it might only work for you for a certain portion of your life too. So you have to keep all these things in mind. With that being said, let's go on to link number 6, which is a study on Iranian children showing that in 2 separate groups, one with, I'm assuming, a basic diet. There's not too much information on exactly all the details of what they were eating, but that compared to the group that had their carbohydrate portion as refined carbohydrates. So white bread, any kind of white food that has been processed down to a very simple carbohydrate. It might still be a starch, but the group that was consuming the more refined carbohydrates as their staples ended up having lower scores on the nonverbal portion of their IQ tests that they were taking as part of the study. So that really emphasizes how important it is for children to be on a healthy diet, not one full of heavily processed foods, especially heavily processed carbohydrates. And the Iranian peoples, they have a culture with some of the longest time having been on an agricultural-based diet, because agriculture really sprung out of the Middle East. So if we compare the levels of adaptation of those people compared to, say, Western Europeans, there's a big difference in terms of the amount of time that they've been consuming a higher carbohydrate diet. So they're more adapted to it, but it still goes to show that they're not adapted to processed carbohydrates. So that is a very important thing that is good to keep in mind for yourself as well as any children you might have. The next few studies, I'm not going to go into each one in depth, but they're all done on rats, and that's links number 7, 8, 9, and 10. A culture with some of the longest time having been on an agricultural-based diet, because agriculture really sprung out of the Middle East. So if we compare the levels of adaptation of those people compared to, say, Western Europeans, there's a big difference in terms of the amount of time that they've been consuming a higher carbohydrate diet. So they're more adapted to it, but it still goes to show that they're not adapted to processed carbohydrates. So that is a very important thing that is good to keep in mind for yourself as well as any children you might have. The next few studies, I'm not going to go into each one in depth, but they're all done on rats, and that's links number 7, 8, 9, and 10, and they show the benefits of low-carb diets on rats. So rats don't have low-carb diets in the wild, but they can still get the benefits and increased cognitive performance in the various things that scientists put them through, the different types of maze trials and things like that. You can see the neurodegenerative prevention that the low-carb diets has on these rats. You can see the improved capillary density without altered blood flow to the brain of the rats. So that's quite interesting. We obviously haven't seen these in human models, so we can't say that that definitely happens, but it's still quite fascinating. And then you also have the neuroprotective effects. If you do any amount of searching on ketogenic diets and brain function and cognitive function, you see there's actually a fair amount of research out there. I've just kind of scratched the surface there. And what I want to do next is kind of get into the importance of things that detract from IQ or cognitive function. And one obviously is overeating. That shouldn't even really need to be said, that when you're gorging on foods, especially poor quality foods, you're going to be running into problems. The other side of the equation is malnutrition. So link number 11 is a study showing a group of people in a developing country that were given in two separate groups. They're both consuming the same diets, but the control group wasn't given a supplement, and the second group was given a protein supplement. So we can assume this is a somewhat lower protein diet, because poorer regions of the world obviously can't have as much animal foods in abundance, and that really goes to show and kind of kick dirt in the T. Colin Campbell camp that, you know, lower protein isn't always the best thing, especially if we're wanting people to be smarter, to be more functional in the long run, to be able to help elevate their communities out of poverty. And link number 12 is a study in Guatemala, similar scenario. A few more variables were thrown in there, but again, there was a group that was giving a protein supplementation, and it was shown that they had improved cognition, and that's of benefit. Now, we talked about how ketosis, which is basically a stressful thing to do to the body, but it's just the right amount of stress that we have this improve in cognition. Some of the ways that improved cognition comes about is the ketones that are produced, but also we have the production of certain things that are quite similar to fasting, because you're cutting off the carbohydrates, and there's benefits to that. Now, something I know some of my viewers may have dabbled in or actually follow is calorie restrictive diets, and that's specifically for longevity purposes. A lot of animal models have shown that to be very effective, but there's still obviously ongoing trials in humans to really show whether that is beneficial or not. But this study I'm just throwing in here, which is link number 13, just shows that there isn't a drop in cognitive performance. There's no increase, it just stays the same more or less throughout all the different factors of verbal IQ, nonverbal IQ, spatial recognition, etc. And that's good news, because there are some people that just throw about things and claims that, you know, everyone who does this ends up with poor results here or something. Of course, there's going to be people that run into problems and they need to do something different, but in this context, when it comes to cognitive function, it appears to be quite safe. We need more studies on humans, obviously, but this is the one study on humans that I could actually find, and this was over a 6-month period, which is significant. Plenty of time to fully adapt to the diet plan that these people were following, and to see that they didn't have drops in their mental function is very promising. Now, there weren't any increases, however, but what we do see increases in, which mimics that same kind of thing that goes on with ketosis, is when we look at fasting, or intermittent fasting specifically. So before I start listing off all these studies, there are different types of intermittent fasting. We know this as eat, stop, eat. There's a book out there called that. The exact parameters of that is a little different from the ones I've talked about on my channel before. Essentially, anytime you have a very short, usually less than 24 hours, where you're not eating, and then you eat for a fairly condensed amount of time, but you almost overeat to make up for the time that you weren't eating. So that seems strange to some people, but it can actually be effective when you're eating enough and you're keeping your metabolism up so it's not dropping. You can actually get some interesting benefits. When I went to Hippocrates, one method they recommended was fasting 1 day a week, and this to them was superior to doing these, month-long juice fasts you see some people doing and advocating, which gives your digestive system a break and all that. And there might be specific contexts where those are beneficial. However, in the raw food community, where I kind of came from in some ways, at least when I started my YouTube channel, I was following that kind of a program. Not the juice fasting, but just the general ideology of raw foods and veganism. There's this slightly anti-physical body mindset, and what I mean by that is that people see the body and just eating food in general as something that is destructive all the time, no matter what. And so when we fast, we're getting to this higher level. And while if you're chronically sick, that can certainly be of benefit for a specific period of time under certain contexts, depending on your individual makeup. Because I've tried to fast for periods of time and it just does not work. Like literally I'm passing out after more than 24 hours. Even on a juice fast with enough calories, if I'm eating like carrot juice and all that, or drinking it. So what we have to recognize is that shorter fasts, but more frequently, can have the same benefit, but also have less detriments. So link number 14 below is my video on the warrior diet, which is Ori Hofmeckler's program of his version of intermittent fasting. If you just are curious about one way to do it, there are, like I said, a lot of different ways. A lot of different people do different breakdowns of the times that they fast versus eat in. But that one seems to be a pretty effective one that a lot of people follow, and still I did it for quite a while. I go on and off of it sometimes, actually. I generally do it when I'm consuming carbohydrates. I don't do it if I'm in ketosis, as I've been for quite a while. I just find I don't want to stack too many crazy dietary experiments all at once, because, one diet that has a certain amount of stress might be beneficial, whereas if we're trying to do too many at once, we don't really know what the effects of that could be. So I tend to keep those separated, but it's worth looking into if you're interested in it, or if you're the type of person that needs some carbohydrates in your diet because of your ancestral background and blood type, etc. That might be a way of getting some of these benefits without going to ketosis. Link number 15 below is a study on mice which shows some of the benefits of intermittent fasting. And then link number 16 below talks about how short-term fasts increase autophagy of neurons. So neuronal autophagy, that means the recycling or breakdown of neurons that are at the point of needing to have that happen. So without this process, which happens naturally anyways, this just kind of speeds it up. We don't have the recycling being taken out or the garbage being taken out on that level in our body. So when we do have that happening, and with increased speed, then we have a faster replacement of neurons, and that obviously is beneficial. So no studies specifically on human IQ that I could find when it comes to intermittent fasting. But there's all these hints that there are improves in cognitive performance with people who do intermittent fasting, whether it's on animal studies or even human studies. One thing that's created through fasting is the stimulation of the production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF for short. And what that does is it helps the pathways in our brain of creating longer-term memories, and it also stimulates neuronal growth. So when we're in that fasting state, we have the production of certain stress hormones, which in turn increase the production of the BDNF. So that's actually what I'm talking about in terms of the beneficial effects of a little bit of stress. Just like you stress your body out with some cardiovascular exercise, at a certain point you start getting endorphins and these things that feel good. Now this isn't so much of a feel-good thing, this is more of an actual physical benefit, which is quite incredible. And that is actually produced both in calorie restriction and intermittent fasting. Now intermittent fasting, the idea behind it is that on a 24 or 48 hour period, you're still getting the same amount of overall calories that you would get otherwise, whereas calorie restriction is limiting that total amount that you get over that same period of time, but you're eating generally more of a standard way. But both ways of eating tend to stimulate the production of this factor. So link number 17 below just talks more about this BDNF and the benefits of it if you want to learn more about that. Now link number 18 below talks about the protective effects against cognitive decline with age that comes with intermittent fasting, and that's in humans. Short fasting is neuroprotective for the brain, and this is link number 19 below, but it is specifically looking at why you need to keep that period of fasting not longer than 24 hours. So it even shows that at 48 hours, a 48-hour fast, a 2-day fast, actually starts to get way more detriments than when that fasting phase is kept within a 24-hour period. Intermittent fasting is generally between 15 and 20 hours of fasting per day, and then there's that 4-hour refeeding period. And it doesn't mean completely nothing is consumed at all. It's just like really minimal bits might be consumed to tide you over until you do have your refeed period. But link number 19, like I said, it's important to recognize that these long, month-long fasts, or even week-long fasts, have detriments, and it could be far better to do these very consistent, ongoing, short-term fasts. You give your digestive system the break to repair and move stuff through. You get the brain and cognitive performance benefits, and then you avoid the detriments of breakdown of muscle tissue and these other things that happens with longer term fasts. So that kind of rounds up all the points I wanted to make about these two broad areas, I guess three if you include calorie restriction, but I was mostly focusing on intermittent fasting and ketosis and the benefits they confer for cognitive function, even IQ. But last three studies is a commonly mentioned thing. You see it repeated in the media way more than I think should be necessary, because it then gets this narrative in people's minds which they then say to you, or are saying themselves out there, saying breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And for me personally, I've barely ever eaten a big breakfast at any point in my life. When I did, I just recall being sluggish throughout most of the day, especially school. Like, that was the worst period of my life in terms of mental function, just in terms of how difficult I found the interactions when I was eating large quantities of food, both at breakfast time but also at lunch. I definitely eat more food in the morning now, as I'm currently doing, than when I specifically am doing the intermittent fasting approach. But let's just look over these three things to kind of counter these myths around how the most important meal of the day should be consumed by everyone to have optimal performance. So link number 20, this is just an excerpt from that study, and it's a sort of grouping and overall analysis of several studies. And the pooled data suggests that omitting breakfast interferes with cognition and learning, an effect that is more pronounced in nutritionally at-risk children than in well-nourished children. At the very least, breakfast consumption improves school attendance and enhances the quality of the students' diets. So there's some tricky wording there. If you actually read the whole abstract, you can see that there weren't significant findings in cognition improvement. There were improvement in attention and things like that for undernourished children, so children that are lower income, eating probably very low quality foods, junk foods, processed foods. Yes, they're so starved for nutrients that getting a big hit of sugary nutrients in the morning, their cornflakes or whatever it is they're eating, is going to tide them over in some remote way so that they can get through the day. And that gives them the willpower to actually stay in school and do better than their classmates that are in the same situation who aren't getting that breakfast hit of whatever it is they're consuming. But we see an improvement of cognition, but only in the very remote way from the sugar and the glycogen flooding the brain. The next study is 3 studies compiled together saying, and an excerpt from it says, the failure to eat breakfast did not affect performance on an intelligence test. It was concluded that breakfast consumption preferentially influences tasks requiring aspects of memory. So that kind of corroborates this previous study, showing that there's an improvement in things like attention and memory and just being present, but there's no actual increase in intellectual capacity beyond those things mentioned. And I threw in link number 22 as well, which is just kind of interesting. It was specifically on Japanese school children. It would be interesting to see the same study applied to children of different ethnicities to see if these different foods, which was just rice versus bread as a carbohydrate source, had a similar effect. So Japanese school children, 2 groups, eating similar diets, but all the carbohydrates for one group was from rice, the other group was getting all their carbohydrates from bread. And it was showing that whichever breakfast staple people chose, there was differences in some parts of the brain's growth. So different parts of the brain had different amounts of gray and white matter, but overall the white rice had the biggest benefit. There were areas of the brain that were grown or healthier in the bread-consuming children. However, overall they didn't have as much benefit as the rice-consuming group. So this is interesting in that we understand that carbohydrates, specifically grain-based carbohydrates, they often have anti-nutrients and qualities within them that are harder to digest. So I was just throwing this at the end so that anyone who does have a need for carbohydrates, you probably want to stick more towards healthy starches. So that is starches without the anti-nutrients. That's the various types of rices. Actually, even white rice over brown rice, surprisingly. But wild rice is best overall, in my opinion. It has the best balance of nutrients, the highest density of minerals and things like that. But white rice is actually better than brown rice in this respect, in that brown rice has more anti-nutrients because of the components within the bran that's still kind of on there. So probably if they also had a group of children consuming potatoes or sweet potatoes, we'd see them as having the best benefits overall, because that is one of the best carbohydrate sources in terms of starch for not having any detrimental effects, which is something we tend to see in all types of grains, but rice less so than the grains such as wheat and these other Western, more hybridized grains. So that rounds up the whole series of studies I'm going to link to. Definitely consider all this information. Find exactly what it is you function best on, because that's going to improve your performance mentally speaking. And play around with it. Don't get too dogmatically stuck to one way of doing things. But if you've always eaten a certain way, consider mixing it up, throwing in the intermittent fasting, see if you work well on that. But you have to follow specific instructions on that. One thing I didn't talk about intermittent fasting is it is the most commonly practiced thing in our ancestral past. When you look across all cultures, at a certain point in our history, everyone was essentially doing that, because you had, if we were to go back to Roman times, for example, soldiers would be marching all day. They'd have some supplies that they could munch on to get through the day. They often munched actually raw grains, not the best idea, but that's what they were consuming, so they probably weren't getting much from that. literally uncooked millet. But then at the end of the day, perhaps even at the end of a battle, they would consume their huge dinners and just literally consume large amounts of everything that they would eat in their specific culture. But that was a common trend among many cultures in various times in the past. Not so much with farmers, but hunters definitely were doing that. And if you go even further back in time beyond post-agriculture times and go to pre-agriculture, when you had hunter-gatherers, they would then generally do that as well. However, women were doing this less so. Women, in some studies, are shown to be less biologically adapted to intermittent fasting. It's a little more stressful on their bodies, or their bodies don't have the benefits that come out of the stress that is put on their bodies. Might be another way of phrasing that. Some can do it. I've heard lots of reports of women functioning well on that, but some end up with menstrual problems or menstrual irregularities. So you want to be gentle with yourself when it comes to that, especially if you're wanting to have children in the near future or are in the midst of having children and having to take care of them, things like that. You don't want to be doing any drastic experiments dietarily if that's the case. This also isn't the diet for children. There's definitely children who have functioned well on lower carbohydrate plans, and that's totally up to your discretion to do. I wouldn't recommend it. I'll just have to say that because growing children need a variety of different things. Probably best to not cut their carbohydrates down by too much at all, but there's definitely groups of people that have very healthy children who consume large amounts of animal foods, whether it's the Maasai, the Inuit, or various Northern European groups. So, with those cautionary recommendations aside, that is definitely the very end of this video, and I'd like to know your thoughts on anything talked about in this video, what your experiences have been with any of the ideas I've presented. And also remember to check the links below to just look into any of these references you want to look into further. So with that, I'll talk to you next time. Take care and embrace life without limits.